Ron from Ronald Law. We're going to be walking through this office purchase and sale agreement. So follow along if you're interested in buying or selling an office building. So this agreement is a pretty neutral form. I think I've tweaked some of the timelines and some of the provisions, but it's generally pretty neutral between buyer and seller. So if you want to download it, you can make those changes to benefit your party or who you're representing on the transaction. But we're going to just walk through, and I'm going to talk through the clauses. What are general numbers in this market that are reasonable? What are changes we can make? What changes affect other parts of the document? As well as just kind of a general checklist for what you're going to look for on an office acquisition. Now, I note that I didn't include some of the exhibits like an SNDA. I really like to include a form of estoppel certificate in the PSA, but there's another video for that, so you can either kind of combine them into the same document, but that's just a general tip that we'd like to see as many form of documents that we're going to require, just to make sure that the copies you get back prior to closing are forms that are acceptable to you and your legal counsel. So let's get started. So here we just have a title that's pretty generic here, improved property office. You want to put your seller entities, including the type, state, same for the purchaser. This can be and or assigned, so this one doesn't have that. We can also put that in to allow the purchaser to assign. No problem. So sale of property subject to the terms. Seller agrees to sale and purchaser agrees to purchase. This is pretty important. In office, I consider it kind of a middle ground. So you want the dirt, you want the improvements, you want the fixtures, you want everything that's not accepted out from purchase money liens. So like seller financing on capital equipment that is not subject, that the landlord has agreed is not subject to it. So that's not conveyed. And this intangible personal property, this is what I was talking about. If you watch some of my other videos where I talk about multifamily, it's incredibly important that you purchase all of the websites, all of the marketing collateral, the trade names, the photographs. There's becoming increasingly a focus on intellectual property that's conveying along with even multifamily properties. Office, I would say, is kind of in between. Just because you have Ron Rohde's office complex, people are not necessarily buying it and knowing that building as Ron Rohde's office. So while there is a focus more on multifamily, I think it is starting to come over to office and retail to a lesser degree. So unit, we define everything. These are very broad. This one is good. Improvements, we usually put the common name. Again, Ron Rohde's office building as it's known on the street. Personal property here. We see this with a lot of offices where you're responsible for fixtures, you have a common area to maintain, you have light bulbs, you have cleaning supplies, you may have a golf cart, you have doors, you have handles. I mean, you've just got lots of inventory and spare parts. And that's, probably on the same level as a multifamily, but some offices, I think that they tend to stock more of these fixtures just because it's mission critical to replace and repair certain fixtures in that building. So personal property, intangible here, we talk about the trademarks, telephone numbers, websites. There's a lot of intangible personal property that you should talk to your lawyer about expanding this section to include passwords, Google My Business listings. I mean, there's so many little things that are important and maybe a buyer expects, but if it's not in the contract, the seller is not obligated to transfer that over to you. Leases, again, they're going to assign those leases. Closing date of this contract. This one's pretty quick. It's kind of normal. I think it's a 60 plus 15 days or a 30 plus 15 days close. You can change that to 60, 45. Office is not in huge demand. Regulation, here we have title company. So a tip again, in your every purchase agreement, you want to make sure that the escrow agent or whoever's holding your funds in the title company is a party to the contract. You want to make them liable under the contract, sign on the line that is dotted. That's a little Glengarry Ross reference for you guys if you know what that is. Purchase price, payment, cash, good funds, okay. Independent consideration. Don't always need this. We have this, but it's not necessary. Survey, title commitment, so within 7 days. You may already have a pre-commitment. If not, you're going to have to update that with the title company. And this is really important that you have the title commitment plus all of the supporting documents. And a lot of times these are hyperlinked in the one PDF, but they may not be. Some people still attach them as separate PDFs. And again, you have 7 days. So this review period is critical. I think 7 days is pretty normal, pretty medium. I've seen them as short as like 3 or 4, and as long as closing day. They could be 30 days. They can be 15 days. They can be all the way up until closing date. Seller shall have 10 days, so that's a little bit long to cure period. If they don't, then the purchaser can terminate within 3 days after the expiration of cure. And so again, this is your remedy. A lot of clients come to me and say, Ron, there's something on the title, we've objected to it, seller doesn't want to fix it. How can we make them fix it? How can we get a discount for that? And I say, you can't. Your options are to just waive it, waive the exception, or close. There's really no middle ground. So inspection period, 5 days, seller will provide inventory, HVAC, I just threw that in there, HOA, if there is, signable warranties. This one's pretty important. I really like it when I can get as-built plans. It really helps you plan and get some interior dimensions and spaces. All leases, including any amendments, and we talk about later the estoppel obligation. So we have a 30-day, so yeah, it's 30 plus 15. Again, 48 hours for access to the property is pretty normal. It's buyer friendly if it's down to 24 hours. 2 days is probably fine. Let me see if this one has a clause. Usually seller will have a right to be present but not required to. So I don't know if we have that in here, but it's just pretty common. Seller shall have the right to be there but not necessarily. Title policy. Again, it just talks about how clean it has to be. Leases are in full force. No unpaid bills. This is really important for office where you may have a large TI balance that is being recovered. And so that should be clearly outlined in the estoppel of, hey, landlord owes me X for these TI improvements, these tenant improvements that I've paid for, and now landlord is supposed to reimburse me, but now he's selling the building. This will become a new landlord obligation if it's on a schedule, or you would push the seller to reimburse the tenant prior to closing, so the tenant can now sign the estoppel and you can inherit a good tenant that is at a zero balance. As is conveyance, so no express or implied warranties. Pretty standard. It's not the worst I've seen, and certainly not the weakest either. You can put brokers in here. I usually don't like to put the actual monetary terms. We just identify the brokers, and then they have a separate agreement with the buyer or the seller. That's pretty common, and it keeps the broker commission debates outside of the PSA, because it's really not relevant to the PSA. It's really just the purchase price and how are you going to pay the broker. Usually it's subject to a separate agreement. So if the broker needs to sue a party, they can do that without dragging this PSA into the lawsuit. Condemnation, casualty, these are pretty important, and we do look at this because we define a material portion. So you can see that these two clauses only have material portion. I don't love that clause, but it is neutral. It doesn't really favor one side or the other. A better phrase is, if we do it here, for more than $200,000 portion of the property, right? So you put a monetary threshold, because then you can actually obtain estimates. Then you can get a general contractor out there to tell you, is this $200,000? Yes or no? Here's my bid and here's why. And it's a factual representation, as opposed to material. Well, material is just always open to negotiation. So here, if it can't be restored, you got to give notices. So we're really active in case something happens. You need to read this clause and understand it. And so if you're the seller, you want to lower, or you want to increase that material threshold so that the purchaser does not have the right to terminate, even if $1 million worth of damage occurs. You can either force the buyer to close by assigning the insurance proceeds. You can give them a discount. You can, fix it. You can restore the property prior to close. But even if it's a high amount, and you can still force the buyer to close, and you don't let them terminate, get their earnest money back for such a minor damage. Date of closing, so we have here 15 days after DD. Special warranty deed is pretty common. Sometimes you can get a general, not always. I don't think it's necessary. Bill of sale, that's for all of the personal property. All the leases, security deposits, keys, that's kind of minor. But again, software, if you have digital locks, if you have a software system, castle, remote entry, you need to explicitly get the transfer of that agreement. You need to get authorization to be able to access that new software to ensure that your property manager or yourself, if you're self-managing, can seamlessly access all of the doors, and you understand how to use that software and the hardware of this building you're buying. So assignment, assumptions, tenant notice letter. So this one we have it attached as an exhibit. I think it's exhibit. That one's B. FERPTA, again, the FERPTA is the foreign buyer requirement. That is a obligation of the buyer to withhold funds and remit. Estoppel letters, 15 days prior, no problem. Purchase price, notices, purchaser is pretty simple. Adjustments, they'll just prorations, right, for property taxes or any other ad valorem taxes. Purchase will be credited. That's kind of a question I get a lot. Sometimes buyers say, is the seller going to write me a check for the deposits? Do I need to keep those in a separate account? No, you don't have to segregate those deposits. There's not going to be a separate transaction. You just get a credit, and then you're expected to pay the tenant this obligation. So all the meters, final bills, that's fine. Sellers shall remit, rents or prorated income. This one is interesting. If it's not prorated, then they can remit to the seller if it's for past rent. But at some point, there has to be a cutoff, and the purchaser doesn't have an infinite duty to always reimburse seller. At some point, if they get money for unpaid rent that was due during the seller's ownership, the purchaser just gets to pocket that money because it's considered like an old debt. I would consider it written off from the seller's point of view, and the purchaser no longer has a duty to remit. This was actually a really hotly debated clause during COVID because you had a lot of tenants who were behind but would likely get money in the near future from some of the relief programs, SBA, PPP, whatever. And so if you had a transaction, you might have a little bit in arrears, but you'd say, for 6 months, I want the purchaser to promise to remit to me any rent payments that are applicable to the past due rent if the tenant was going to get an influx of money. And so we were debating a lot of those, the amounts, the timing, the accounting reporting requirements, all this stuff. So just something to consider if there are any arrears or likelihood that the tenants will pay for past rent that was due during the seller's ownership but is received post-closing. So here, purchaser will pay for the owner's policy. That's fine. Everybody pays their own attorneys. That's great. Seller's default, you can terminate. That's fine. You get your money back. Or specific performance. That's pretty critical. You usually have or, you don't get to do both, but return of earnest money. All right, purchaser default. Your seller's remedy is just liquidate damage. You keep the deposit. That's good. Miscellaneous section. These are all pretty generic. Notices. This isn't critical. I oftentimes I don't see the email section filled out. I don't see a telephone number. I would just suggest that you fill it out, as best you can, and add a with a copy to. And here, we're usually putting, say, the attorney contact information. And then what's interesting is, do you require the notice to go to this address as well for notice to be sufficient or not? And so some contracts will require a copy to the purchaser as well as a copy to the seller's attorney, and others don't. So it just depends on what you want because the cut goes both ways, and it can punish you as well as them. So here, parties agreed to notice via electronic mail. Super important. Do you want to do email or do you only want to do hard copy? Entire agreement, 90 days. That's very, very short. Maybe I should say this is seller friendly. But representations and warranty, 90 days is nothing. That's going to go by in a heartbeat. Electronic signatures, time is of the essence, business day definitions, great, attorney's fees. These are all pretty boilerplate. You know, I've got Dallas because that's our hometown. That's where we live. You know, execution day. That should be when it's signed. So not as critical. We have, you know, a place for the survey, just so we're very clear on what the legal description is, and then the survey that matches that legal description for what parcel we're buying. Tenant notice letter. Again, some of the other exhibits that I've had, we will include SNDA forms, estoppel certificates, and check out those other videos if you want to see what those forms look like. But that's it for an office. So if you're interested in purchasing or selling an office building, contact Ronald Rohde Law, and we'd be happy to walk you through this transaction. Thanks, guys.